Greetings. This podcast relates the story of the disastrous Pánfilo de Narváez expedition to colonize Florida. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, granted Spanish conquistador Pánfilo de Narváez a license to claim the Gulf Coast of what is now on the United States. He gave it to him on December the 25th, 1526. Pánfilo de Narváez lived from about 1478 until November 1528. Historians know very little about his early life. Possibly native to Castile, he entered military while still a youth. He joined a campaign to conquer Jamaica in 1509. He then moved on to conquer Cuba under the command of his uncle Diego Velázquez de Cuellar. His uncle would become the first Spanish governor of Cuba. Diego Velázquez de Cuellar dispatched Hernando Cortés to Mexico to explore. Questions arose about Cortés's loyalty, and Diego sent Pánfilo to arrest Cortés and bring him back. During the expedition, things went awry. Cortés persuaded most of Pánfilo's men to defect to him by promising them gold. Then, Cortés captured Pánfilo and his depleted force during a heated battle. During the battle, Pánfilo lost an eye. He spent 2 years in Veracruz as Cortés's prisoner, after which Cortés sent Pánfilo back to Spain. Cortés then departed on his quest of conquering the Aztec Empire. After his return to Spain, Charles V granted Narváez a title of Adelanto of Florida. This entitled him to conquer Florida and the Gulf Coast. Narváez had to secure the funding for the expedition. The license gave him 1 year to recruit an army, travel to Florida, found 2 towns with at least 100 colonists, and establish 2 forts along the coast. The Crown would receive 5% of any wealth the expedition acquired. By June the next year, Narváez was ready to depart. Narváez had gathered a fleet of 5 ships and over 600 men. The expedition departed Sanlúcar de Barrameda on June 17, 1527. The ships arrived on the Canary Islands about a week later, a tradition that began with Columbus's first voyage in 1492. At the Canaries, they would resupply with water, fruit, and other supplies. The fleet departed the Canary Islands and arrived at Santo Domingo sometime in August. They would remain in port here for some weeks, as Narváez wanted to buy 2 ships and acquire more supplies. During their stay, an ill-fated expedition led by Vasquez de Ayllón arrived in Santo Domingo. Over 450 men out of the 600 that had departed perished during this expedition. Shortly after the arrival of this group, about 100 of Narváez's men deserted. The depleted expedition voyaged to Santiago, Cuba, where Narváez had relatives and friends. He used these contacts to obtain much-needed horses and other supplies. He sent 2 ships to Trinidad to obtain the horses and some supplies from the estate of a friend there. A hurricane sank both of these ships, destroying the horses, supplies, and the lives of about 60 of his men. He then sent 4 ships to Cienfuegos to regroup and 1 to Havana. They spent the winter in Cienfuegos, planning to resupply at Havana in the spring. The fleet departed Cienfuegos, but then became ensnared in the Canaros Shoals for about 3 weeks. Stormy seas freed them, but unfavorable winds swept them past Havana and into the Gulf of Mexico. After an unsuccessful attempt to reach Mexico, Narváez decided to continue on to Florida, which he reached in mid-April 1528. Narváez had hired a pilot named Morello, a man that claimed to know the Florida coast well. He had described the bay to Narváez. It sounded ideal for the expedition to use as a base. The expedition spent several days searching for this port, which they did not find. During this search, they lost another ship. Eventually, they found a harbor, which historians have identified as current-day St. Petersburg. The expedition landed on April the 12th, 1528, with around 300 men and set up camp. After setting up camp, Narváez declared himself governor of Florida and ordered the natives in the nearby village to convert to Christianity, or he would attack them. Narváez spent Morello off on one of the ships to search for the bay which he had spoken. If he found it, Morello was to return to Cuba and get another ship, which Narváez had supplied and waiting. After sending Morello off in search of the bay, Narváez made a fateful decision. He decided to split his force into 2 contingents, one of which would travel by land north to where Narváez believed the location of Tampa Bay was. The other contingent would sail north to the bay and meet them with supplies. The main problem with this plan was that Tampa Bay was south of this location, not north. On May the 1st, Narváez's force set out on foot. Food supplies were short, and soon the troops were starving. The expedition eventually reached a village near the Suwannee River, which one of the men drowned crossing. The starving men ate his horse. The Spaniards continued into Florida's Panhandle region, eventually reaching another village which they attacked in hopes of finding gold. Finding no gold, they did find maize, which they helped themselves to after capturing the village. The villagers counterattacked twice and were repulsed. The Spanish resumed a march, however, the natives continued dogging them, using hit-and-run tactics to harass them. Wading through swamps under constant attack and starving, the Spanish eventually reached a bay near the present city of Apalachicola, Florida. Morello, meanwhile, had made an unsuccessful search for the other bay. He returned to the starting point to find Narváez and the other ships gone. Then he returned to Cuba to fetch the other ship and return to their camp. The three other ships returned after failing to reunite with Narváez's men. The men spent almost a year searching for Narváez's party to no avail. Eventually, they returned to Spain. The Spanish camped on the bay they called the Bay of Horses. They named it thus because on this spot they decided to build boats for a voyage to Mexico while using their horses for food. The Spanish revered their horses and named the bay in their honor. The men built a forge out of a log and bellows from deerskin. Using this apparatus, they made hammers, chisels, and other tools from their weapons. By September the 22nd, 1528, they built 5 small boats and set sail for Mexico with about 50 men in each boat. A hurricane blew them off course, sending them to an area historians believe was near Galveston in South Texas. During the voyage, the boat containing Narváez separated from the others. No one ever saw that one again. About 80 men remained at this point. The expedition subsisted on starvation rations until 1532, when 4 survivors hiked out of the area. Through a route historians have not been able to document, the men reached Culiacan, Texas on July 1536. Shipwrecked, starved, and finally enslaved by the natives, Alvar Narváez de Cabeza de Vaca survived 5 years of hard existence, Karankawa tribe of Texas. He and 3 survivors, out of the original company of about 80 men, eventually made their way to Mexico and rescue. Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca lived from about 1590 through about 1560. The son of a minor Spanish nobleman, Francisco Nunez de Vera, and his wife Teresa Cabeza de Vaca y de Zurita. De Vaca was a native of Jerez de la Frontera, Cádiz in Spain. Historians know little about his early life other than his parents may have died when he was young. Probably raised by relatives, he entered the military in 1511. After serving in Italy, he joined Pánfilo de Narváez's expedition to Florida in 1527. That expedition met with disaster, and de Vaca found himself and about 80 survivors adrift in the Gulf of Mexico. They floated on 2 rafts they had built from native wood and nails they had forged from stirrups of the horses that they had eaten, and their weapons. The 2 rafts finally washed up on an island the Spaniards called Malhado, or Island of Doom, probably Galveston Island off the coast of Texas on November the 6th, 1528. The rafts were in poor condition and needed repair. During this repair, a large wave caught them and carried them away, leaving at the mercy of the local natives. The natives at first welcomed them until an intestinal disease killed half of them. They blamed the disease on the unfortunate Spaniards and enslaved them. During the next 5 years, the Spaniards lived with several different Amerindian tribes in Texas area. De Vaca had scant knowledge of medicine, and he used this to become a healer during this time. During the next 5 years, the number of survivors dropped from the initial 80 to 4. De Vaca, Alonso de Castillo Maldonado, Andres Dorantes de Caraca, and Esteban. Esteban was an African slave that had accompanied the expedition. These men eventually escaped and made their way southwest. They hoped to encounter the Spanish-Mexican post. During their travels, they crossed Texas and perhaps wandered into New Mexico and Arizona. Thus, they became the first Europeans to enter what is now the American Southwest. The men eventually entered northern Mexico and reached the site of the present city of Culiacan. Here they met a group of Spanish slave traders. The traders, after getting over their astonishment of the men's appearance, took them to Mexico City. After his return to Spain, de Vaca wrote an account of his journeys. The French account, The Journey of Alvaca Nunez Cabaza de Vaca and his companions from Florida to the Pacific, 1528 through 1536, has been translated by Fanny Bandelier and is available online. The next episode will cover the discoveries and expeditions of Jacques Cartier. Find out more about colonial history of the United States by purchasing the book Colonial American History Stories 1215 through 1664. The book is a timeline of events from Christopher Columbus to 1664. It is part of a larger series of 12 books, the Timeline of United States History series. The history at this time takes the reader up to the opening year of the Revolutionary War, 1775. I am currently writing 1776. You can find the books on my website, www.mossyfeetbooks.com. There are links to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Google Play, and other online booksellers. You may choose to purchase the book in ebooks or softbound versions. An audiobook version is available on Google Play. At the conclusion of this series, I will compile the episodes into an audiobook. The audiobook will be available on Audible, Amazon, Apple, Barnes & Noble, as well as many other audiobook sellers. You can find this podcast on Apple, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, TuneIn, and many other podcast platforms. I publish a video version on YouTube and Rumble. You can also order the books directly from me, the author, on the webpage. If you wish me to sign the book, just send an email to mossyfeetbooks@gmail.com requesting a signed book and instructions on how you want me to address it. Note, if you send me an email, I will add you to my contact list. Readers on the list will receive an email from me announcing when I publish a new book. If you do not want me to add you to the list, tell me and I will not add you. Listeners to this podcast that want email notifications of my releases can just send me an email requesting addition to the list. You can choose to have your name removed at any time. If you browse the website, you will find dozens of sample chapters, one for each of my books. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and thank you for listening.